Greetings and welcome as we continue our walkthrough of the book of Genesis. I am the Bible Paladin and hope that our journey together brings us wisdom and inspiration. Up until now, we have been looking at some of the universal themes in the prehistory of Israel as we've been reading through the book of Genesis. And these have been setting the stage for the family of Abraham and his descendants. We've just finished reading the story of Noah, in which him and his family have become the new creation, which will begin to populate the world. And so we'll be starting with a genealogy. It's often called the Table of Nations because it shows how the people begin to spread across the earth. These people spoke many different languages, had different cultures, lived in different places. And so we'll also be reading the story of the Tower of Babel, which shows how they began to be scattered. And so let us begin with chapter 10 and the genealogy of Noah, which gives us a good landscape of the peoples that populated the earth at the time. And so, as always, we begin with a prayer as we ask the Lord to guide our reading of the Scripture and give us wisdom. These are the descendants of Noah's sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, to whom children were born after the flood. The descendants of Japheth, Gomer, Magog, Madai, Javan, Tubal, Meshech, and Tiras. The descendants of Gomer, Ashkenaz, Dithath, and Togarmah. The descendants of Javan, Elisha, Tarshish, the Kittim, and the Rodanim. From these branched out the maritime nations. These are the descendants of Japheth by their lands, each with his own language, according to their clans, by their nations. The descendants of Ham, Cush, Mizraim, Put, and Canaan. The descendants of Cush, Seba, Havilah, Sabta, Raamah, and Sabteka. The descendants of Raamah, Sheba, and Dedan. Cush became the father of Nimrod, who was the first to become a mighty warrior on earth. He was a mighty hunter in the eyes of the Lord, hence the saying, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter in the eyes of the Lord. His kingdom originated in Babylon, Erech and Akkad, all of them in the land of Shinar. From that land he went forth to Assyria, where he built Nineveh, Rehoboth-ir, and Calah, as well as Rezin, between Nineveh and Calah, the latter being the principal city. Mizraim became the father of Ludim, the Anamim, the Lehabim, and the Naphtahim, the Pazrusim, the Kazlahim, and Kaphtorim, from whom the Philistines came. Canaan became the father of Sidon, his firstborn, and of Heth, also of the Jebusites, the Amorites, the Gishgashites, the Hivites, the Archites, and the Sinites, the Arvadites, the Samarites, and the Hamathites. Afterward, the clans of the Canaanites spread out, so that the Canaanite borders extended from Sidon all the way to Gerar, near Gaza, and all the way to Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, and Zeboim, near Lasha. These are the descendants of Ham, according to their clans, according to their languages, by their lands, by their nations. To Shem also, Japheth's oldest brother, and the ancestor of all the children of Eber, children were born. The descendants of Shem, Elam, Ashur, Arpachshad, Lud, and Aram. The descendants of Aram, Uz, Hul, Gether, and Mash. Arpachshad became the father of Shelah, and Shelah became the father of Eber. To Eber 2 sons were born. The name of the first was Peleg, for in his time the world was divided, and the name of his brother was Joktan. Joktan became the father of Almodad, Sheleph, Hazamaveth, Jerah, Halram, Uzul, Diklah, Obal, Abimael, Sheba, Ophir, Havilah, and Jobab. All these were descendants of Joktan. Their settlements extended all the way from Mesha to Sephar, the eastern hill country. These are the descendants of Shem, according to their clans, according to their languages, by their lands, by their nations. These are the clans of Noah's sons, according to their origins and by their nations. From these, the nations of the earth branched out after the flood. Historically, scholars have been able to identify many of these names as they represent the various cultures and nations that would have been known to the ancient Israelites. and I apologize if I stumbled or mispronounced any of them. We are told that the descendants of Japheth were the ancestors of the maritime nations, and they had their own language and clans. They were thought to be the people who lived in northwest Mesopotamia and Syria, and from whom the Greeks descended. The descendants of Ham, as we learned of his curse in previous chapters, include many of those who would be considered enemies to Israel, including the Egyptians, Canaanites, Philistines, and Hittites. It is not certain who Nimrod is, but he was obviously known to the Israelites and would have been known as a mighty warrior, the founder of some great cities, such as Babylon. In addition to Babylon, we also hear included in Ham's lineage Sodom and Gomorrah and Nineveh, cities also known for their wickedness. Finally, we have the genealogy of Shem, which will be continued at the end of the next chapter. And it's important to note that Shem's descendants include the Semitic peoples as well as the Assyrians, who are considered to be the ancestors of the Israelites. And in verse 32, it gives us the purpose or the theological purpose of these genealogies. From these, the other nations of the earth branched out after the flood. Just as we saw that the time after the flood could be seen as a new creation, it was not just for individuals, but for nations as well. They have fulfilled God's command to multiply and fill the earth, and they have done so with God's blessing. When we look at this table of nations as a whole, if you count all of the names, you should come up with 70. And this may be not quite right just because of difference in translations and going from Hebrew to Greek, Latin, English, and all of that. But the intent, as they found from ancient manuscripts, was that it was 70. And of course, that's important because 7 is the number that means perfection. And 7 times 10 is just amplifying that number. So what does that mean? Why are we listing these 70 families? And I think it shows that in the fullness of time, in the perfect moment, was when Abraham came along. This was God's plan to begin this new covenant, this new people with this new individual. And so we see that Abraham then will represent really that fulfillment of what God has started. And Abraham, or Abram, comes from the line of Shem, the oldest son of Noah. And we see now that with Abraham coming out of this new creation, that something even greater and even new is about to happen. Now this all sounds great and exciting, and we are ready to get to the story of the patriarchs or the ancestors. But we have one more story, a parable really, which seeks to explain why the people have been scattered into many tribes and speak many different languages. But it's interesting that in this story, it's not about people being bad to each other, which we often see, and rather like the first act of rebellion, they are challenging God himself. And so, let us get reacquainted with this story. The whole world had the same language and the same words. When they were migrating from the east, they came to a valley in the land of Shinar and settled there. Then they said to one another, "Come, let us mold bricks and harden them with fire." They used bricks for stone and bitumen for mortar. Then they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the sky, and so make a name for ourselves. Otherwise, we shall be scattered all over the earth." The Lord came down to see the city and the tower that the people had built. Then the Lord said, "If now, while they are one people and all have the same language, they have started to do this, nothing they presume to do will be out of their reach. Come, let us go down there and confuse their language, so that no one will understand the speech of another." So the Lord scattered them from there all over the earth, and they stopped building the city. That is why it was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the speech of all the world. From there, the Lord scattered them all over the earth. Some might miss that the name Babel is the Hebrew word for the name Babylon, which is the setting for the narrative. Also, we see as introduced at the beginning that this is in the land of Shinar, which we were told in the genealogies is where Babylon was. Now, the Babylonians were known for their temples or ziggurats in which they held their pagan rituals. Now, at first glance, when reading this story, it doesn't seem like they're really doing anything bad. They're working together and they're building the city together. And I'll admit that as a child, this story never quite sat well with me. I thought, why would God come down and confuse the language of the people who were just trying to work together? And with various languages, nations, and cultures, it ended up being the cause for so much division and racism and stereotypes and everything else. And yet, what is the meaning of this story? Why would God be upset with what the people were doing? Well, for one, the people were doing it to challenge God. At the very beginning, they said, we want to make a name for ourselves, a name. And since they wanted the name of God, Hashem, and this is what the people wanted. They wanted to be the gods. They wanted to be the creators. They did not want a God over them. They were going to build a skyscraper, basically, to reach the heavens, to have a place that they ruled from. And so, of course, God looked down upon them and said, this is not what they were created to be. They no longer look to me as their God. They look to themselves. So once they've declared that God was no longer necessary, the punishment that God gave them was rather poetic. For at the beginning, it says they were doing this because they were afraid they were going to be scattered across the world, which is exactly what God did. He scattered them. And so that they had to, again, rely on God, relearn, rebuild, and realize their limitations. Before moving on to the final genealogy, let's look at how this story is still relevant today. In fact, in many ways, it can be seen as a modern parable. Throughout history, God has been very influential in culture and in nations, not only in the way that we talk and worship, but in art, architecture, and even work habits. And I think many people have began to push that aside. We feel like the people of Babylon, how God is no longer necessary. We can do it all on our own. We don't need God. We don't need the scripture. We don't need the Bible. We don't need a church community. And so I think in many ways, we can look at this in the way that history continues to develop. Today, it's individuals or organizations, businesses, teams, groups of people that get the praise and the accolades, but not so much God. We think we've done it all on our own. In many ways, the thought that seems to pervade can be summed up in this particular scene from The Simpsons.
Dear God, we pay for all this stuff ourselves, so thanks for nothing.
And while many probably wouldn't say it like that, I think oftentimes the sentiment is there. And this brings me to another parallel that I've seen in recent times. The year 2020 was an interesting and difficult time for so many with the outbreak of the virus. And I think in a time in which we have pretty much declared that we can do anything, that we no longer need God, it is kind of ironic that we are struck down by a practically invisible virus. Now, I'm not saying that God did that, but I think we can certainly see the parallels between this and the story of Babel. So what can we learn from this? Shops, restaurants, schools, beauty salons, sporting events, even places of worship were shut down. People could no longer congregate in one place. In essence, they were scattered across the earth. So much work and education simply stopped. Businesses halted to the point that economists panicked and feverishly shoved models at each other to find solutions. Scientists in the world of medicine worked feverishly as world governments and others demanded that a cure and vaccines would be created without delay. But the only solution they can come up with at the beginning was scattering the population that believed that they could accomplish anything without God. Politics aside, this is the one reality of what occurred during the pandemic. Like the Babel parable, humans were physically scattered, which adversely affected not only the economy, but relationships, education, and mental health as well. But what happens when we turn back to God? When we realize that we are all connected, and we need to be. This last genealogy sets us up to read about what a true relationship with God can look like, and the promises that come with it. We'll continue reading with chapter 11, verse 10 and following. These are the descendants of Shem. When Shem was 100 years old, he begot Arpachshad, 2 years after the flood. Shem lived 500 years after he begot Arpachshad, and he had other sons and daughters. When Arpachshad was 35 years old, he begot Shelah. Arpachshad lived 403 years after he begot Shelah, and he had other sons and daughters. When Shelah was 30 years old, he begot Eber. Shelah lived 403 years after he begot Eber, and he had other sons and daughters. When Eber was 34 years old, he begot Peleg. Eber lived 430 years after he begot Peleg, and he had other sons and daughters. When Peleg was 30 years old, he begot Reu. Peleg lived 209 years after he begot Reu, and he had other sons and daughters. When Reu was 32 years old, he begot Serug. Reu lived 207 years after he begot Serug, and he had other sons and daughters. When Serug was 30 years old, he begot Nahor. Serug lived 200 years after he begot Nahor, and he had other sons and daughters. When Nahor was 29 years old, he begot Terah. Nahor lived 119 years after he begot Terah, and he had other sons and daughters. When Terah was 70 years old, he begot Abram, Nahor, and Haran. The final part of the genealogy that we began in the last chapter is illustrated here. And while it is reminiscent of the genealogy from Adam to Noah, which lists all the ages, and while the ages are still outrageous and fairly symbolic, they are definitely shorter than before, just as God said that people would not live as long after the flood. At the end of this genealogy, we are introduced to Abram, whose name means the Father is exalted, or God is exalted. And later, of course, God will change his name to Abraham, which we are more familiar with. But until then, I will use the name Abram as it is in the text. And so after this, we really get into his story and the promise that God makes with him. But before moving into this new era, this new time of Abram and God's relationship with him and his family, let's look at some of the themes that we've seen in these last couple of chapters and really throughout the first part of Genesis. From the beginning of Genesis up until this point, we have been introduced to a God who is both powerful and personal. He is the creator of all things, and all those things and creatures are good. Yet he created one special creature in his own image and likeness. He put into them his very breath, his very presence. We are told that this creation was made to be very good. Unfortunately, this creature also has a tendency to disobey and to do things his own way. And so after this realization, it has been a story of humans trying to get back to being very good, the way that they were intended to be. Of course, humans fail repeatedly, but every once in a while, they get back on track and remember God. And all the while, God does not give up on his creation. He has a plan from the beginning, makes promises, and keeps his word. His heart is grieved when humans fail, and he finds other ways to make his plans known. After all, this is a God who can bring out life and goodness out of chaos and darkness. Ultimately, it is a story about relationships. There is this divine cosmic relationship between God and his creation, and we are part of that. We are meant to be in harmony with creation, but also in a unique relationship with the Creator. The relationship of God, although, is not one of equal partners. But often we believe it is, and we act as if it were. God is in charge, and we are his creation. By eating of the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and bad, we believe that we know better, that we don't need God. However, such thinking usually gets us into trouble. Turning away from God brings suffering, confusion, and ultimately death. Even so, God does not abandon his creation, but continues to call us back. It is also the story about relationships that we have with each other, beginning with our families and extending to all people. In these relationships, we are equals. No one is more the image of God than someone else. And the way in which we treat others reflects on the way in which we understand God's love for us. Because God is a God of love and compassion, we are supposed to imitate that sentiment in our relationship with each other. And I believe that these themes that came out in the first part of Genesis are the themes that will continue throughout this book and really throughout the entire Bible. And so why am I still talking about these two parts of Genesis? Well, as I alluded to at the beginning of the series, really when we look at Genesis, we see two distinct genres. The first is kind of the primeval history, often called mythology, which talks about this time kind of before written history. And it's often fantastic in nature. And these are the stories that we've been reading: Adam and Eve, Noah, the flood, Tower of Babel. And from here, now we're going to slow down. And we're going to move into an epic family history. The epic narrative that we have just been talking about really looks at the world from a particular worldview and the truths that they understand. Now, whether we look at them from a literal or allegorical framework, these themes mentioned above can be appreciated by all believers. The universal nature of these stories makes them uniquely relevant to people of various faiths, as their focus is on relationship with God, the created world, and its inhabitants. The remaining narrative in Genesis is more specific to the nation of Israel, as it moves away from the mythological setting and into a national epic of a particular people that trace their heritage back to Abraham. We'll be following Abram and his family as God calls him to be a great and blessed nation. I do look forward to our continued reading of Genesis as we jump into that story. And I hope that you are finding this educational and inspirational. Until then, remember the Creator and do good.